Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Absolution or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Faith, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Absolution Chapter 3. Morning. The morning arrived when Nicta was scheduled, by Tally at the behest of Dr. Bauer, to take a trip to the vet's office by herself. It was making her cranky even before her eyelids cracked open an hour earlier than they needed to be. Unlike the literal ray of sunshine she woke up with draped across her body, she was not a morning person. Nicta dreamed of setting the Hearst mansion on fire with him alive in it, dreamed of rising dead, plaguing their efforts to liberate a nation, dreamed of all the times she was able to summon the power and unleash it through her work, obliterating her enemies and allowing herself to feel whole again. All the things she could no longer do, and it was killing her slowly. She'd barely slept and was a bear on the best of mornings, so she shut her mouth for the sake of Tally and Sarah and brooded in solitude. Tally got up with her eventually, while Sarah slept on, but the company was short-lived. A distress call from Petra left Tally rushing off to base, not before giving assurances that she would indeed be there to pick Nicta up after her session. Nicta desperately wished she could handle things on her own in the city and ease some of the pressure on her partners. Only her chosen crossover vehicle wasn't due to be delivered until sometime next week, and she was hardly about to jump on a bus. Her non-committal grunt at Tally didn't go over well. All she could think about was skipping out on the appointment and finding a bar somewhere with a lighter in hand and a new face. Complications be damned. Tally just pursed her lips and subdued the urge with one long stare. She probably didn't need to use her special skills to figure out Nicta's covert operation wasn't so covert. As irritating as that was, Nicta resigned herself to the one-on-one. She was doing this for Tally and wouldn't jeopardize things between them just because she was a cranky asshole before 10 a.m. Sarah was putting in the effort too. They owed Tally that much for putting up with their shit. All this meant Sarah was put on Nicta duty for that point forward, so her chances of slipping free were just as crappy with General Tight-Ass on her heels. Nicta wasn't even grumpy with Sarah that morning. She just couldn't shake the sick twist in her gut over being expected to sit there by herself and talk about her feelings. It was gross. While they'd had a light discussion that were deemed productive about the moving thing, it wasn't enough to change the stalemate. They had agreed to save those talks for sessions to avoid more fights at home for the time being. Despite the free pass to avoid the subject, Sarah had accused Nicta of withdrawing further a few days ago, and since then Nicta had basically proven her right. Out of spite or self-preservation, who the fuck knew? Nicta certainly didn't. Her skin was a booby trap of spikes that set off any time one of them tried to touch her during waking hours, and she hated that the mood in the house was mostly due to her own stress. All of that she attempted to push aside for today. The coffee was flowing and French toast made within an hour of being on her feet, all in the dissociative state she had mastered when she needed to pass time in prison. Nicta was at peace in her own head, particularly at times of trouble, a master of compartmentalization. Her prickles only came out when there were other people she had to step around to hold things together. Sarah joined her when Nicta was scraping the last bite from her plate. For a moment the two stood on opposite sides of the kitchen, not exactly on edge but far from at ease and normal. Nicta was usually out of sorts on the mornings of their appointments and Sarah knew it. When things were decent between them, Talking to a stranger about how they once had hated each other felt weird and invasive. Gudrun liked to point out they had a lot of baggage, left unclaimed, and there was no harm in sorting through the pile now that things had come to a head. Nicta hated poking the dormant volcano when it was just that, dormant. The problem was only when the bastard blew up unexpectedly in their faces. From her place between the kitchen island and counter, Nicta kept her stance leaning heavily onto the island, setting her fork on the syrup-soaked plate and wiping a dab of frosted sugar from the corner of her mouth. "There's more keeping warm in the oven," she told Sarah, nodding over her shoulder. "Help yourself." Sarah's whole physique loosened and she wandered closer. "Don't mind if I do," she murmured. The sight of Sarah Alder blinking sleepily and shuffling across the kitchen in nothing but a baggy tank top, boy shorts, and slippers was always more than enough to preoccupy Nicta so long as she was in range. After years of nothing but braids and crisply pressed pantsuits, disheveled Sarah was a sight for sore eyes and sore loins alike, usually the cause of the latter, if Nicta was honest with herself. She missed how easy things used to be. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she watched Sarah saunter around without a care in the world, plating some French toast and putting a pathetically small amount of syrup on top. Pitiless these days, Sarah claimed she didn't like the sugar rush she now had to feel for herself. She sure as shit didn't mind getting drunk off her ass with good wine or whiskey if given the chance. Nicta loved when Sarah got drunk, frisky, particularly with Tally while she got to watch. Sarah caught Nicta staring and did a double take. An affectionate smile warmed free. "What?" Wordlessly, Nicta shoved over the small jar of powdered sugar, eyeing the bits of Sarah framed nicely by the boy shorts. Sarah took one look at the mountain of white powder soaked in syrup remaining on Nicta's plate and shook her head. "You've consumed enough for the both of us," she scolded, without any real substance behind it. "Thank you." Nicta shrugged and took her dishes to the sink, dumping them unceremoniously despite an empty dishwasher waiting beside it. She half expected to hear Sarah's verbal exasperation in her ear. Honestly, that's why she did things most days. You could take the army out of the general, but you couldn't take the type A out of Sarah Alder. Instead, arms circled her waist in silence and pulled her ass firmly against a set of bony hips, catching Nicta by surprise and instinctively causing her to stiffen. Sarah waited for a beat and Nicta relaxed again, as was the norm whenever she was touched unexpectedly. "Thank you for breakfast," came the warm husk against her ear, drawing goosebumps and a shallow gasp from Nicta against her will. Her skin was on fire and nervous system alight, and it had nothing to do with the mountainous sugar rush not scheduled to hit until later. Nicta's instinct was to slip free and turn around, and Sarah's hold gave her that option if she chose it, but for once she allowed herself to be still. The only time she didn't mind someone behind her was when it was Sarah or Tally. Right now Sarah's breath was tickling her neck and Nicta couldn't bring herself to pull away. "Yeah," her voice croaked out, and she cleared her throat to try and save face. "Thanks for, not wearing any pants." Sarah's smile stretched wider and a husky chuckle made Nicta's inside squirm with pleasure. Nicta swallowed hard and finally did turn in Sarah's grasp, leaning against the sink and gazing up at her. "I should make you breakfast more often if it gets you out of bed looking like this. Collar me a fan." She tugged on the hem of Sarah's tank top and found herself blushing, unable to hold eye contact for long. Fuck, why was she nervous? Sarah never made her nervous. Horny, yes, and furious, sometimes all in the same moment, but she prided herself on being someone that couldn't be cowed by the literal face of authority for all of which kind these last 300 years. Sarah knew it too. Nicta risked a glance up and could read the pity in her eyes. She hated when it was directed at her. "If it makes you feel less antsy, I'm not particularly looking forward to what Gudrun has to say to me on Thursday when I take my turn." Sarah's voice was flat, but the thin smile she wore drew Nicta's attention. "Perhaps you can take solace in knowing some of what you will say will make its way back to me in subtle ways. As I've been informed, I can sometimes make it difficult for those close to me to speak their truths." Nicta wasn't sure if Sarah was quoting Gudrun or Tally at this point. She felt squirmy either way and was looking forward to a change of subject if it came around. It wasn't that they never spoke openly or honestly, but these days, with Sarah standing right in front of her, holding her, the truth was always more painful to hear, no matter the subject or context. Nicta hated how badly she wanted to run into the woods at the stupidest moments. "You're nervous?" Nicta echoed rather than giving it into that urge, cocking an eyebrow in disbelief. The great General Alder, woman of steel, acid in her veins, lightning at her fingertips, is nervous about talking to a woman 16 times her junior about her feelings? "Yes," Sarah answered simply, and she might as well have smacked Nicta for all the disbelief written on her face. "You seem surprised." It was Sarah's eyes that softened first, and she brushed her fingertips across Nicta's cheek, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am occasionally nervous about discussing things when the subject matter is dear to me." Nicta felt it in her chest, automatically tearing her eyes away despite the rest of her not moving. Pain, warmth, something sickly sweet that she wasn't sure the origin of, maybe just breakfast. The rest of her hardened in Sarah's arms, and Sarah gave a soft sigh of her own. "What would help you relax, love?" No matter how loud the hurricane inside her veins, not even Nicta Batan could let that one go. She drew her eyes back to Sarah's face, and a suggestive smirk was working its way free from the icy surface that had temporarily frozen her over. She saw Sarah delight in the reaction, all while the customary eye roll and deep sigh of defeat made an appearance. "Very well," Sarah murmured, and Nicta was suddenly twirled around the opposite direction, pressed against the island she had previously been eating at. Sarah's hands dropped from her waist and cupped behind her thighs, lifting Nicta like she weighed nothing and planting her butt on the quartzite surface. The fire in Nicta's belly grew from ashes, and she clutched Sarah between her legs, groaning when she was hauled to the edge of the counter and suddenly found herself a breath away and maybe half an inch taller than the tree that was smirking at her. "You're freakishly possessive sometimes," Nicta reminded her with a warm grin, sliding her fingers into Sarah's tresses and feathering a touch along the base of her neck. The tension in her own shoulders melted away as Sarah's hands traveled up her back and kneaded into the muscle beneath Nicta's shirt. The kiss promised more than words ever could the moment they connected, and Nicta's failed attempts at ignoring the trepidation that had been plaguing her since last night melted away. Maybe Tally said something to Sarah, who tended to brood harder than normal when she was distracted, or maybe Nicta just hadn't given her enough credit when it came to Sarah reading her moods. She seemed to know exactly what Nicta needed right now. Nicta moaned into the kiss and pressed her body into her partner's, the hands gripping her back, hauling her so close to the edge of the counter that Nicta tightened her thighs around Sarah's waist to stay upright. They were heated and alone in the world so long as they were touching, and Nicta remembered how easy this used to be. In the jungle, surrounded by a contingent of witches and a tent outside of 7 biddies no doubt listening in on every moan and every orgasm, it was always the same. Things between them weren't always so hard, and sometimes Nicta wished she could erase the last 27 years of her life and start fresh. Except, she immediately silenced such a foolish notion, because she needed Tally all the same. Time and experience had landed her here for a reason. No matter how hard it was inside her own head sometimes, she wasn't willing to give either of them up. Their lips broke apart when she was out of breath, and Nicta's forehead pressed into Sarah's, her eyes drooping closed. "You ever feel like there's 2 sides of you living in the same body?" she murmured, surprising herself at the honesty. The turmoil over the last year had come to a head for a reason, but moments like these reminded Nicta of why she was still here. She didn't know why Sarah was, and that thought immediately shut her down again. Sarah felt it too, and to her credit didn't push. She drew back from the kiss but kept the rest of her body holding Nicta close, hips digging into the counter while strong legs flexed around them. "All the time," she admitted. And again there was the light of surprise in them both at how easily the admissions went both ways. "It used to be worse. It can pass. You may need to give it time." Nicta wasn't sure what that meant. She hoped there was some sort of light at the end of the tunnel scripted in there somewhere, Shaky, flickering, and probably a stupid oil lamp rather than LED and reliable, but anything to keep her focus forward. Right now, the light was shining from Sarah's unimaginably blue eyes, and Nicta took a moment to drown herself in them. I hate that we keep hurting Tally. Again, the truth slipped out of Nicta and Sarah caught it in her hands, leaving Nicta clinging to her natural embarrassment without letting her disappear. If left alone, sometimes Sarah worried Nicta would vanish from this plane entirely. "We won't always," Sarah whispered back, and Nicta closed her eyes again, drawing an ache from below Sarah's ribs. Sometimes it was difficult to accept how much more relaxed and open Nicta would be with Tally, but she was never surprised or resentful. Tally had a piece of Nicta that she had never betrayed, never taught not to trust with her whole heart, and Sarah understood that their history would always exist no matter what she did to repair it. Nicta was not without her own source of hurt and malice as the leader of the spree, but death and resurrection had somehow helped heal that part of Sarah long ago. 5 years behind bars and buried underground had done nothing but harden and chip away what little pieces of herself Nicta had barely clung onto. They came from vastly different places of healing and trauma, but the important part was it all brought them here. Sarah held Nicta close and tried to convey that as she gazed softly into her eyes. Nicta had emerged last year, a wall of razor blades and barbed wire, and the media circus that followed had been a battering of grenades and tidal waves for the better part of 9 months. Sarah counted her lucky stars Nicta had survived long enough for Tally and her to pull her to safety. If speaking to someone was going to help them at all, then Sarah would do it. For Nicta. For both of them. For all of them. "How long until we need to leave?" she murmured, brushing her lips across Nicta's without drawing her back into a kiss. "Too soon," Nicta sighed, deciding to forego the rest of her plans and kissing Sarah's mouth instead. "How many years were you in prison?" The clock ticking on the wall grew louder. Nicta's ears twitched with every talk of the big hand, drawing her ire more than once and leaving her with the urge to work it silent. She felt her throat tighten with the seed and immediately swallowed it back. Probation was a bitch. 5? Gudrun supplied an answer for her, drawing Nicta's attention back and waiting for the hardened lines to ease away from her features before continuing. 5 years of solitary confinement can be 4.5. Nicta rested her elbows on her legs and dropped her gaze to the thumb ring she twisted around continuously, a nervous stick she had picked up ever since Tally gifted her with the ring itself. 4 in solitary, 6 months in Gen Pop if we're being specific. Then 6 months here in the States while Sarah and Tally finalized my release. Out of a 30-year sentence. That's not so bad. Sarah advocated for you? Gudrun clarified, and Nicta squirmed in her seat. Yeah. She cast another look to her right, frowning when the blinds were noticeably drawn over today and blocking the view she usually distracted herself with. She and Tally spent 2 years working to get the inhumane conditions lifted halfway through my sentence. First with an extra hour of yard time per week, then another year to get the sentence commuted to 15, 6 months until I was out of solitary, and another 6 for the sentence to be commuted entirely, on account of time served, both on active duty and in custody. Your role in defending the White House from the assassination attempts on President Wade no doubt played a part. I guess. That was a hell of a time. Nicta recalled being the sole witch standing in the Oval Office at one point, trying to convince Wade she wasn't there to kill her while the White House was under siege. She'd taken out 12 Camarilla agents single-handedly before Sarah and reinforcement had arrived. Nicta subtly swayed in place, realized she was doing it, and forced herself to lean back against the couch. With the windows closed, her eyes skittered around the office for something, anything else to look at. Didn't mean much in a court of public opinion. I remember. Gudrun smiled kindly when Nicta briefly jerked a glance her way. I gather from our talk so far that this is the main reason you're reluctant to discuss the move back to the city with your partners. A scowl broke free, and Nicta was once again staring into her hands. The thumb ring burned a trail around the base of the digit as she spun it. Oh, I've discussed. No matter what Sarah tells you. She just doesn't like my answer. It's hardly a surprise, given what followed your release. Hearing someone other than Telly say it was nice. Nicta would give her that. The constant barrage of media, finding her no matter where she went, bombarding those in the command at Fort Salem to release her location when she was able to square away in Tally's and Sarah's home. The court of public opinion calling for vigilantes to take over where the justice system had failed was a particular favorite, and for a while, Nicta couldn't leave the house without a guard. Nicta tried hard to be numb to it, as she was with everything else around her. But the walls had been crumbling in, and she hadn't seen a way out short of fleeing the country. Until Sarah and Tally offered one to her. And because she loved them both more than she could stand, every single day there was nothing to keep her company but 4 walls and a drippy stone ceiling. She had taken it. They were worth the isolation, and she was happy. It's not like I don't understand what they're asking is hardly bigger than what they did for me. Nicta's hackles rose, and dark eyes suddenly bore across a short distance, daring the good doctor to challenge her. Of course, that didn't happen, and Nicta reined in some of her annoyance. They went to bat for me. They got me out, whether or not I deserved it. And it's not like I'm an idiot when it comes to civilians having an opinion on my freedom either. I hardly expected to be given a Medal of Valor. It is a big ask, isn't it? Gudrun stated. Asking you to risk that kind of attention again. It's no small thing. If Sarah's having trouble seeing things that way. She isn't, though, is she? Nicta released a frustrated sigh and threw herself back against the couch. Her eyes bore holes in the closed curtains to her right. She'd said as much. She knows that I'm reluctant, she clarified. But every time the discussion comes up, she gets this look in her eyes. Like I'm wasting her time with my petty bullshit and she's just waiting for me to give in. Nobody turns down the famous General Alder. She cracked in a weird voice, rolling her eyes to the ceiling. And yet Sarah's embrace that morning, those calming hands digging into her flesh and pulling her close, kissing her mouth and giving her an outlet for the unbearable anxiety growing underneath her skin. Nicta felt guilty immediately upon saying all this. There were 2 people living inside of her, and they were never sure which side of Sarah to come down on. I'm not exactly an expert of the psyche of someone who's been around longer than our country, Gudrun began, but I can only imagine how it affects one's perception of a moment in time. To Sarah, this stressor will pass, and her thinking may be that you'll be settled and happy in the city with Tally by then. Think of it as someone who is far-sighted, fighting with the details of something a nearsighted person is trying to describe with difficulty. 2 competing perspectives, the same end goal in mind. Sometimes it's hard to put yourself in the other's shoes. Tally's shoes are what concern me, Nicta admitted. I hate that she's caught up in this. Sarah and me, we've always been sharp with each other, but it works. It's just that now Tally's stuck dealing with us both, and I'm the rock in the door keeping this shitty chapter of their lives from closing. Gudrun's brow ticked, and she looked down to scribble something in her notes. Nicta scowled. She hated when the woman did that. It always made her try to figure out what fucked up things she'd said, and how it would be repeated to the others later. It's not easy for you to have feelings of gratitude towards other, is it? Gudrun glanced up and witnessed the storm brewing behind her patient's eyes. Particularly if you feel like on some level there's an imbalance, or that you're holding them back. With Tally, your relationship is weighed differently because you 2 are newer. You don't have the volatile history you do with Sarah. Nicta frowned. Who would I be to brush off what they've both done for me? I'd still be rotting away in a hole if your people had their way. Maybe I should be, but I'm not anymore, and I'm hardly about to throw myself back to the wolves. She waited for the doc to throw something back at her, and was met with silence, so she continued. As for your imbalance, Sarah's always right in her mind. I'm actually looking forward to your attempt at speaking to her on your own, she added with a short laugh. Good luck. Maybe I'll transmogrify myself into a fly with hands, so I can watch from the corner and eat popcorn at the same time. Gudrun hummed, but otherwise left the bait flopping uselessly at the tip of Nicta's string. Years ago, when you and Sarah were together, did you fight over things? Big or small? Often? Nicta struggled to put it into words. Not exactly, she tried. We were us. There was a war going on around us. We were on the front lines trying to quell a rebellion, and then we were apart. Love and loss and all that shit rekindled 25 years later. It's your stereo-fucking-typical Hallmark crap. Just throw in a mass murder and emotional betrayal and stick our faces on the credits. Nicta stood up then, because her legs needed to move, and she would otherwise bounce a hole in front of the couch. She stalked along the length of the room and finally yanked back the curtains, choosing to lean her palms against the windowsill this time and glare out at the gray ceiling of clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. She remembered just how often the guards had chosen cloudy, rainy, or otherwise shitty days to bring her to the yard, shackled at the hands and ankles, a collar muzzling her throat and a gag in her mouth. There was so rarely any sun. Those were the only moments she saw the outside world, and it sure as shit wasn't every week like it was supposed to be. Unwittingly, the open window eased just a tiny bit of Nicta's tension. Here, she could see people, birds, a life moving about below. She's never told Sarah or Nicta details about the shitty accommodations, back then or since. They had done enough to keep her sane and work for her freedom. Sounding ungrateful or nitpicky was hardly something she wanted to set on their shoulders. At one point, Nicta estimated it was 2.5 years since she actually saw the sun itself, and only then because of Sarah. Those memories plagued her now, and she gave her head a rough shake to settle onto the present again. Her stance at the window never shifted. She didn't like being cooped up without any natural light these days, and this office felt like a tomb. I'm going to ask you something. I'd like you to take a moment to consider your answer. Gudrun's voice carried across the room. Nicta realized she had lost track of her thoughts and had no idea how much time had passed. Another fun carryover from her days locked in a stone hole underground. Nicta's sharp eye whipped behind her again, and she had to give the good doc credit for not flinching. She was aware of how she came across when she was ornery, and right now she felt like when Tally told her that her colors were all swooshy and mad, whatever that meant in knower speak. Gudrun waited for a response and received nothing, so she continued. Did you decide to give your relationship with Sarah a second chance because of Tally or because of Sarah? Nicta wanted to bristle. Instead, she deflated. It wasn't a secret. At least, she didn't think it was. On either side. Because of Tally, she admitted softly, hating how pathetic it sounded when she said it out loud. I mean, it doesn't mean I'm with Sarah and don't love her, she clarified quickly. I'm not a monster. Tally just softened us. She was a bridge we never had before. I loved her. Sarah loved her. And for some bizarre reason, that girl loves us both. And the two of you? I love Sarah, Nicta said without hesitation. And once she said it, some of the storm inside of her lessened. I've spent almost 30 years loving that woman, even when I hated her. She sometimes wondered how. Sarah no doubt had those same questions. What mattered most was that no number of assassination attempts could apparently keep them from falling into each other's lives. Tally brought us together, Nicta clarified as she thought more about it. So yes, it's because of her we let ourselves try. She's not the reason I stayed, though. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for both of them. The voice that haunted Nicta from within reminded her of the doubt she carried about it being the same situation from Sarah's perspective. Tally and Sarah had each other for 5 years. Nicta had never really stopped feeling like a pity addition in some ways, all while knowing that was a ridiculous brush to paint their entire relationship with. Gudrun made some more notes, and Nicta caught her smiling to herself. Good. I'm happy you seem at peace with that decision. Peace? Nicta snorted, looking out the window again. Interesting phrasing. Peace doesn't mean completely unconflicted, Gudrun reminded her. Knowing your goal is half the battle of people who come to me. If you already believe you're where you want to be and just need help finding stable ground, then you're better off than some who haven't reached that conclusion yet. Stable ground was something Nicta didn't think she was ever going to be familiar with, nor had she ever been. Being with Tally and Sarah was as close as she'd ever felt. It's not a fair burden to put on Tally. Something inside Nicta quieted as she played with the thumb ring some more. She's a ray of sunshine stuck with two dark clouds that she's constantly trying to lighten the fuck up. And so you're here, trying to work on it. For her sake and your own. Nicta rolled her eyes and debated popping open the glass pane in front of her. You've got an answer for everything, don't you? What is there? A little book of phrases hidden in your notes? You're really flipping through an index and feeding me what you think I need to hear? You're hardly my first patient to deflect using sarcasm, Miss Batan, Gudrun chuckled, drawing ire from Nicta and remaining unaffected. What I'm wondering is if you ever let yourself acknowledge the big steps that you have already taken, instead of insisting you're at square one compared to your partners. Steps? Nicta echoed, turning to face her again and relaxing back against the window. She crossed her arms. Yes, steps. Gudrun met and held her steely gaze. You spent nearly 30 years removed from a society that treated you kind, less than human for a large part of it. For the last 5 years, you were completely cut off from the world. Yet you emerged. A little broken and beaten down, perhaps, but you walked out of that situation and made the decision to live. You've worked through what some would think are impossible trust issues with a woman you actively had a game of assassination tag going with. And you've let yourself love and be loved by another person in return. Gudrun looked at her like she was stupid, or at least that's how Nicta took a sign of kindness most days. You've already taken steps and should acknowledge them to yourself, Nicta. Most people in your shoes would have crawled into a hole and maybe never come out again. Nicta blinked a few times, stunned into silence, and eventually tore her eyes away. She was so visibly uncomfortable it wouldn't have been a stretch for her to jump out of the 4th-floor window just to get away from this conversation. Wouldn't that give the doc some notes to fill Sarah in on in 2 days? Wow, she murmured instead, awkwardly scratching at her ear. Must be some medical school you went to, Doc. I'm responsible for killing a massive amount of civilians in retribution for what I thought was a good reason. And here you are, making me think a part of you actually cares. I'm not paid to care, Gudrun stated, and Nicta swore there was a little hint of amusement in her eyes. Nicta both liked and hated this woman. She was a tough nut to crack. Doesn't mean I don't, or that I do. I'm here to help you unravel what's darkening up your mind, even when you spend half of our sessions deflecting. Snorting, Nicta glanced at the carpet and scuffed her shoe. Touché, she murmured, and let it drop for once. We've established that your physical relationship with Sarah is sometimes different from the one with Tally. Gudrun took a moment to reflect on her notes, though Nicta suspected it was only to give her enough time to settle again. How have you found it since we began working on your communication exercises a few weeks ago? Nicta smiled to herself, bitter and wistful at the same time. She woke up with Sarah wrapped around her from behind this morning, and I wanted to curl back into her warmth and body weight so badly, so she'd gotten up and made breakfast instead. She didn't need a shrink to tell her that was fucked up. We've had some sex, she admitted, and there was a squirming in her belly that begged her not to open up. Tally's been with us both times. It was great, if you want a diagram for your notes. She does this thing with her legs where she... No, thank you, Gudrun cut in with a plain smile. There was a glint in Nicta's eyes as she shot her a wicked grin. Gudrun ignored it and moved on. What I would like to discuss, then, is your conflicting realities within your domestic life and your sex life. Please, have a seat. Nicta's smirk dropped away, and all hints of amusement vanished. She stayed put at the window, frowning at the shrink, and only moved when the woman made another gesture to the couch. Begrudgingly, Nicta stalked her way over and collapsed dramatically onto the cushions again. Look, sex isn't a big deal to me, Nicta stated, shrugging it off. I'm good at it, Sarah's good at it, Tally's good at it. You don't need drama or words or feelings half the time, it's just instinct. And for witches, we use it for a power boost. Our society's a whole lot more open to it than most, so don't make a thing out of it when most of us are more comfortable getting naked than having a conversation with the same stranger. Gudrun's eyebrows shut up, and she waited. Nicta groaned and closed her eyes. Okay, that was a random example. Don't make it a thing. I'm with my girlfriends for more than just sex. I'm just saying it's easier to let go of the other stuff. It's not unusual. In the context of casual sex, I would have to agree with you, Gudrun said carefully. But in this case, when you're in an established relationship with someone like Sarah, I tend to pause. She waited to see if Nikta would say anything and continued when she did nothing other than glare. Nikta, to be frank, you have a very dismissive attitude when it comes to sharing your body with a woman you say you love. Yet for the last few weeks, I've listened to both you and her, and Tally for that matter, tell me that when it comes to your emotions, you brick up like a wall if things get too real. Nikta bristled and looked like she was ready to jump again, only holding back when Gudrun raised a hand to let her continue. The sneer was unmistakable, though. Nikta was not at all happy with where this was going. I think it's something you really should sit back and consider. Gudrun's eyes were kind, despite the fire in Nikta's, and she held them to nudge her point across. Why is it you feel it's perfectly acceptable to give your physical self to someone you may not fully trust, when you guard the rest of you like you're still locked down in solitary confinement? Sweat broke out along Nikta's brow, and she hurriedly stared out the window again, now that the curtain was drawn back. This goes back to the steps you've taken, Gudrun prodded lightly. You've made the leap to sharing intimacy with someone you still have major conflicts with. For some people, that's the hardest thing to overcome. For others, using your physical body to stay present in a relationship while the rest of you is hiding in the garage, so to speak, can be a sign of our internal conflicts with ourselves. How you view you, she added when Nikta shot her a confused look. Our sense of self-worth, of what is worthy of being given versus what we hold on to. Nikta's brow furrowed, and she tried to unravel the mess of words. What? I'm a big hoe for sleeping with the woman I love while having difficulty expressing my emotions? Is that it? Gudrun sighed patiently. No, Nikta. In some ways, you're already comfortable with the most intimate part of your relationship, but you hold on to what remains because you're afraid of what she can take away from you again. Your dignity, your sense of self-worth. The love that you feel was ripped away from you once upon a time, and you've been afraid of losing again now that you've stepped back up to the plate. The doctor leaned forward and tried to press her point home while Nikta fumed in silence. That giving Sarah your body will keep her just satisfied enough to not care if she doesn't have the rest of you, which, by the way, never works in a healthy relationship. And if she loves you, which I suspect she very much does, she's going to notice and react accordingly. Nikta scowled and dug her toe into the carpet. Her skin was crawling, and she really hated every last fucking word coming out of this woman's mouth. Or, I enjoy having a good sex life with my girlfriends, and just because we sometimes have disagreements, doesn't mean everything decent needs to disappear. Gudrun tilted her head. So you disappear before she has a chance instead? Nikta closed her eyes and released a heavy moan, rubbing her hands over her face. I really hate you, she said bluntly. Gudrun smiled slightly and crossed her legs the other way. Fair enough. Tell me if I'm wrong and why you think so. The physical pain stemming from this conversation was making Nikta's ADHD worse than usual. Look, we fuck good, okay? I don't know how to be more clear. Our sex life was never an issue. Not then, not now. So why not enjoy the thing that gives us and Tally pleasure? Sarah doesn't hurt me in bed unless I ask her to, and there's some kinky stuff I'm not going to discuss because it's not relevant. Gudrun actually chuckled at that. You would be surprised at some of the things my clients share with me. If you decide to, you really can shock me, Nikta. If not, then all I can suggest is to internalize what we've discussed here today and really reflect on how you see yourself through their eyes. Meaning? Nikta cocked an eyebrow and was a painting of confusion. Gudrun held her steady. Meaning, do you only view yourself as worthy addition to their sex life? And do you hold back on sharing the rest of yourself for fear they never really needed you for anything else? Nikta's heart hammered and swelled into her throat. If she wasn't so very aware of the terms of her probation, she wouldn't be holding back on lighting the table between them on fire. As it was, storm clouds brewed outside, whereas moments before the sky had only been gray many miles above. You have a colorful past, full of pain caused and received, but if you truly want to move on with your life, you need to decide what you're willing to give of yourself and then pass that on through your partners. Gudrun's gaze remained steady despite the storm brewing around Nikta inside this room and beyond the building's walls. It's something I can give you an answer on. Only they can. Only you can. But I encourage you to examine this by yourself and try to broach it with Sarah and Tally. You'll stew in it to death before it drives you crazy. Nicta felt herself being pulled apart from the inside and desperately tried to clamp down on the semblance of self-control she had woken up with that day. "What if I can't?" she whispered in a broken whisper, because the reality of how much she hated this session didn't change the fact that it resonated. If she lost Tally and Sarah, and there was no one without the other, she didn't want there to be, then she had nothing left in this world to live for. The weight of her sins, of the death and destruction she'd been responsible for, would push her deeper into the quicksand, and it wouldn't be long before she disappeared for good. What if she was dragging them down with her just by staying? She didn't know if she wanted them to want her anyway, or if she wanted them to let go before she hurt them, or if she needed to let go before they hurt her. Fuck. What if there's nothing left inside of me that's worth anything to them? Nicta's haunted eyes finally met with the doctor's again, and she knew they were wet, even if nothing escaped. All the pain, all the suffering, all the betrayal? What right do I even have left being afraid Sarah won't ever really love me again? Punishing yourself by suffering in silence will take them down with you. Gudrun looked like she thought about handing the box of tissues from the table over, and then thought better of it. Nicta's energies were erratic and volatile. It didn't take a witch to sense she was on edge. You need to decide, first and foremost, what you're worth to yourself before you can ask the same of them. Tally was waiting for the spikes to retract before she reached out. Sending them off again prematurely would only assure Nicta took longer to calm down, and she had been anything but calm from the moment she got into the car. For Nicta's sake, Tally played the game like she couldn't tell her girlfriend was coming apart at the seams, and doing everything she could to hold it together. Being a knower had its perks sometimes, and in this case, she knew whatever it was bad. "Where do you want to go?" Tally asked, stealing a side glance at Nicta, who was staring out the window and vibrating the air in the car every time she breathed. "There's a taco truck by the cove, if you're hungry." The road they needed to take back to the highway was a single lane in both directions, and brought them closer to the sidewalk. Beside her, Nicta pulled the edge of her coat up and shrunk her cheek down into it, hiding her face from any wayward pedestrians that might look at her. The windows were tinted, but the paranoia never seemed to leave her. Tally didn't get an answer, and she didn't push for one. Nicta probably wanted to go home and either run laps around the property to burn off the feelings she wasn't able to express through magic, or else she would light the neighbor's property on fire with her vocal work and be thrown back in prison for violating her probation. It was inhumane. 3 years without using any work from the time of her release. Add that onto the 5 years she was locked away in chains and a collar, and Nicta had been trapped inside herself for nearly 7 already. The tracker implant would detect any vocal work she used, and the violation would land her in some serious trouble. They'd had a few close calls, 2 slip-ups that Sarah called in favors to Barry, but something of the magnitude Tally could feel building would be the end of their happy little life. She refused to let that happen. The exit Tally took off the highway was a few miles ahead of their usual. Nicta was so preoccupied that she didn't notice until they were barreling down a country road, trees thick on all sides, and distinctly not the lane leading to their property. "Tell?" Nicta eventually blinked, finally noticing they weren't headed home. "Where are we going?" "Tacos can wait," Tally said bluntly, gripping the steering wheel hard and keeping her eyes on the road. The pressure in their car was still building. "I think we should go for a walk first." Nicta's brow crept higher as she snuck a peek out of the window again, then back at Tally. "You're taking me somewhere to kill me?" she joked, and Tally's sharp glare told her she wasn't in the mood. Nicta held up her hands and muttered something in surrender. The little show hadn't changed anything. Tally could still feel the sickness twisting inside of Nicta, and knew it needed some kind of release before they went back home. Sarah was waiting, and while Tally expected their partners to be sensitive for Nicta today, she also knew Nicta could probably use some time to unwind first. Those two were on pins and needles, especially on therapy days. Right now, one little thing might make Nicta snap. They pulled into a campground, to which Tally waved away the closed for the season sign and parked beyond the barrier. There were no other cars around when she jumped out, leaving a hesitant Nicta to unbuckle and follow at a more wary pace. All Nicta wanted to do was turn around and go home, Maybe sleep for a week and pretend her life wasn't happening. Everything was heavy. Her limbs, her soul, her breathing. She had so little left in her, and yet there was an untamed storm threatening to crack her wide open, still boiling beneath the surface. "What are we doing here, Tal?" she bemoaned, following her partner through the trees and along a dirt trail. "I liked your taco ideas better. Hot dogs are overrated if you're thinking cookout. Plus, we don't even have any food." Tally ignored her and kept walking. Nicta sighed in exasperation and jogged to keep up. The air was crisp and the sound of birds and other wildlife signaled life in the trees. Eventually, Nicta managed to find her stride next to Tally. Not much was said for the first few minutes. Tally brushed her fingers against Nicta's hand and laced them together when given permission to. "See?" she said, peering over at her girlfriend and letting her brow tick when she saw Nicta was still on edge. "It's no dirt biking, but it's peaceful." Nicta forced out a return smile that quickly faded. Tally was a sweetheart and always trying to make her feel better. Somehow the kindness only made Nicta feel worse. "I don't deserve you." The trail wound through the trees and took them farther from the road. Tally kept waiting for nature and the fresh air to help, for Nicta's internal tension to dissipate, but she only wound tighter as they moved along. After a while, Nicta dropped Tally's hand under the guise of tucking it into her jacket pocket for warmth. "Nick?" Tally spoke softly, pausing on the path and turning to her. Nicta immediately moved away and faced the opposite direction, clamping her eyes shut and emitting a shaky breath. Nicta kept absolutely still as her internal struggle raged on. "Where are we?" "No idea," Tally admitted, glancing around them. "Just felt right to come here." Oh, so one of those knower things where Tally just sometimes followed her instincts. Great. Nicta bit her lip and scraped together whatever normalcy was still rolling around in the bottom of her barrel. Tal? Remember last time you followed your nose and nearly ended up awakening an entire den of zombie bears?" "That was one time," Tally grumbled, pouting. "And they weren't zombie bears. They were the guardians of the warlocks we were hunting. I found them, and the unit took them out before anyone else got hurt." "Except you," Nicta said pointedly, risking a tight smile over her shoulder and immediately looking away again. She breathed, and it choked off in her throat, and to her horror, her eyes welled up. Fuck. She couldn't do this now. Not here. Tally swallowed hard as she sensed a deeper shift, and she took a tentative step closer. "I keep waking up every night with this sense that you're drowning, and I don't know how to help you. Please look at me," she implored, and her heart broke when Nicta's whole demeanor simply hardened more. Sometimes, Tally looked at Nicta and swore she had never left that underground cage. She wanted to find members of the Hague and unleash her fury on them. She kept her sight in check because she was afraid of what she might see here and now. "Nicta," Tally tried again, "please talk to me. I love you. Sarah loves you. Whatever it is, you can trust us." Nicta squeezed her eyes shut and something hard locked in her chest. She couldn't pull in a breath to save her life. Gudrun's words came roaring back and sliced through her like a razor blade. How was she supposed to figure this all out and just go and bring it up in a casual conversation? "Hey Tal, hey Sarah, sorry you wasted the last 2 years of your life trying to make me happy, but I'm a miserable sack of shit that doesn't deserve to be here." Tally watched with a deep ache shining through her eyes. She didn't pity Nicta. That wasn't something Tally would ever do. But Nicta felt worthless nonetheless. "You can't help me," Nicta finally croaked, and she cringed at how pathetic she sounded. "Neither of you can help me anymore, Tal. Don't you get it? I'm broken. I'm fucked. I'm a shell of a person who's still trapped in that hole the Hague built especially for me." At least that tomb had 4 walls, and she knew what to expect. Ever since she'd stepped into the sunlight again, Nicta had been at a total loss. Every move she made was a stumble, and she was this close to pitching over the edge of a curb and into oncoming traffic. The spiral was starting to consume her, and Tally was gazing at her like a wounded animal. Nicta flinched away from the responsibility of having put that look on her face and turned away again. Nicta wondered what she did to deserve this girl, and knew the answer was a big fat fucking nothing. She had never done a damn thing worth Tally or Sarah in her life, before, during, or after the fucking war she helped start. So much loss, So much fucking waste. So much death. Bile rose in Nicta's throat, and she moved over to clutch the nearest tree. The power inside of her was surging, and a hot sweat broke out as she struggled to hold it back. It would be so easy to let go and get it over with. Right now, it felt inevitable. She would fail and unleash herself upon the world again. She could level everything within a mile of her and give Petra Bellwether and her army every excuse in the book to descend on her head. They were all waiting for it to happen anyway. Not even Sarah could call them off now. Hell, maybe they would call in the Hague's goon squad. Nicta would love a chance to fire back at them before they took her down. She had vicious memories of the beatdowns and twisted mind games the team assigned to her care took when they got bored enough. She deserved no less. Nobody on planet Earth was feeling sorry for Nicta Batan. That included Nicta herself. It would be so much easier if I'd never left. Nicta? Tally's sharp voice tried to cut in, but she was too far down the rabbit hole, and now clouds were brewing overhead. Nicta, you need to stop. You and Sarah would be happy, finally. She had been cold for 5 goddess-forsaken years. Nicta balanced the razor's edge of desperately wishing she was back underground where the lack of future was solid and swearing she would die before they ever locked her up again. If she didn't give them a choice, then her own would be stripped from her hands. I'm so sorry. Tilly's hands clamped on her shoulders and Nicta shrugged her off. Her fingernails dug into the bark beneath them, and she let the pain ripple through her, feeding off of it, letting it pull her attention back from the sunless walls and never-ending cold. Nicta crumbled to her knees and clutched her head. She would have let go by now if Tally wasn't there with her. Sweet, loving Tally Craven, who had the absolute worst taste in women when it came to picking the safe ones. At least Sarah had had her shit together now and would make sure she ended up okay. Tears streamed down Tally's face as she grabbed Nicta's and tried to force her to look at her. Please don't do this, she begged, and the storm above unleashed its first crack of lightning. Nicta's mood affecting the weather was bad enough, but what Tally could sense coming would be so much worse. Neither she nor Sarah could save Nicta from herself if she released 7 years of pent-up grief and frustration into the wind. In that moment, Tally wanted to burn the whole establishment to the ground. The Hague did this, devised this torture designed to ensure Nicta filled their guidelines, forcing a witch like Nicta to hold in what they were for 7 years, bordered on telling a civilian prisoner they couldn't breathe until their probation was over. Tally grabbed Nicta's face and hauled her in, smashing their lips together and trying to bring Nicta back to life while the wind kicked up and thunder began to boom. Nicta tasted like defeat and sorrow. Tally's subconscious screamed at her to act. Use me! Tally yelled over the wind, ripping back from the kiss and boring her gaze into her girlfriend's. She tightened her grip on Nicta's face and held theirs together, pushing every last ounce of willpower she possessed at her and opening her mind all in one go. Nicta! Use me! There was a moment where she didn't think it would work, that Nicta would unleash everything she was feeling and it would be over. But the opportunity thrust at her mind, and Tally's desperate pleading offered the olive branch Nicta needed to see the surface of the water again. If Nicta failed, it would be Tally and Sarah who hurt the most. Nicta didn't think. She seized, and Tally pulled her in. The link cemented in an instant, and Nicta unleashed 7 years' worth of rage and self-loathing through Tally. Tally threw her head back, and Nicta's voice screamed to the heavens. When Tally woke up, it was like the worst hangover of her life. She sat up on the ground, feet stretched out in front of her, and blinked woozily at her surroundings. Something akin to a sonic boom had leveled or burned most of the trees surrounding their pathway, bits of leaves and tree fiber still floating around them, until he heard a distinct smoldering of burning organic matter nearby. There was rain spilling around them now, light yet steady enough to keep her from worrying they had accidentally caused a devastating forest fire in late fall. Definitely not something she could blame on a freak lightning storm. Whoops. A light nosebleed trickled down her upper lip, and she hurriedly swiped it away. Tally cradled her head as her senses slowly returned, and with them, the intensity of what had ripped through her and Nicta the moment before the explosion went off. Pain, loss, a bottomless pit of grief and self-loathing. Tally never knew one person could hold that in for so long and still get up every morning. She wondered if Nicta was hiding it from herself as much as she was from her and Sarah. Searching for the missing half of the equation, Tally spotted Nicta's form curled into a ball a short distance away right around the time Sarah's voice boomed in her head. "Tally, what the hell happened?" Tally winced at the forcefulness and rubbed her temples. Definitely worse than the hangover she had had at graduation. "I'm fine, Nicta's fine, just be ready when I get her home," she far-speeched back, hoping that would placate the distress signal for now. Nicta was alive, Tally knew that much, but how fine she was after such a large display was still up for debate. Tally's legs wouldn't quite work yet, so she crawled forward across the pathway and landed a hard grip on Nicta's jacket. "Nick?" she croaked, curling herself over Nicta's body and trying to get a read on her. The vibrations Tally had been feeling in the lead-up were gone. In their place was a blissful emptiness she mirrored as she briefly linked with Nicta again in case she was injured. There were no injuries, no desperate need to pour out her rage and hate of herself at the world. But the unbearable sadness remained where the rest had emptied. Nicta was awake, and tears blurred her face while she sobbed silently into the dirt. Tally's tear ducts welled. "It's okay," she whispered, burying her face into Nick's neck and tightening her arms so hard Nicta probably couldn't breathe. How her arms could even manage that amazed Tally. Her whole body felt like she'd been struck by lightning and was still fizzling from the inside out. In the background of her mind, Sarah paced and fretted. Tally struggled to communicate when everything inside of her was focused on keeping Nicta grounded. It barely worked. Nicta cried harder in response to Tally's attempts to comfort her. She muttered a frantic string of "I'm sorries" on repeat in between pained breaths, as though trying to starve herself of even more oxygen. It was all Tally could do to squeeze Nicta tightly as she felt Sarah wedge her way in there, too, somewhere along the way, grateful as always for their partner's long-distance capabilities. Together, they made a desperate bid to channel their love for this broken woman and instill a sense of calm among the darkness. Tally realized then that she might have saved Nicta from the Hague tonight, but there was a long way to go to save her from her own demons. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.